The champion did not draw the windbone saber. He watched the round-eared biped shuffle onto the blue sand with a mop bucket in one hand and a plastic-handled pry bar tucked under his arm, and he refused, in front of the entire assembled court of the Asaran of Nine Rings, to soil his blade on a janitor. He told his attendant to toss the human a maintenance bar and let the arena hounds finish him. That order, 3 throat clicks the auditorium translator flattened to a bored, contemptuous, "let the dogs have it," was the last order the champion Krethval ever gave without trembling. On the high balcony behind him, Ves Otran, second voice of the Grand Chamberlain, had already wagered 3 tithe worlds that the human would be dead in under 1 breath. Neither of them yet understood that the arena camera would eventually record, hours later, a severed champion's crest laid beside a mop bucket, the way a janitor arranges the last of the trash he has finished with. The air over the blue sand tasted of copper filings, burnt ozone, and rendered synthetic oil. 6 hours earlier, the human had been mopping a shuttle bay. His name was Pete Molnar, and he was 39 standard years old. He came from a place on Earth called Duluth, which no alien on the flagship had ever heard of, and none of them would learn to pronounce. He had welded hull plate on the Great Lakes for 12 winters before signing the Imperium contract, because the shipyard closed and Rhoda's medicine was not free. He was 5'10". He had the shoulders of a man who had swung a 10-pound hammer for a decade, and the hands of a man who had done it in the cold. His crew coveralls were grey with black knee patches, and his boots had once been steel-toed and had, after enough deck shifts, become simply toed. He carried a pry bar because a good tungsten pry bar had more uses than a wrench, a hammer, and half the tools in a maintenance kit, and because on the Azaran, the internal humidity ate anything not tungsten in about 4 sector turns. The Imperium Manifest listed him as Sanitation Liability Class 4. It listed the pry bar as personal effect. Krethval, whose true name was a chain of throat clicks the flagship translator flattened to Krethval, sat on a mid-tier bench above the arena in the black and brass regalia of a champion who had killed 312 times in ritual combat. His neck frill was gold-lacquered, and his main plates were oiled, and his windbone saber lay across his knees in a sheath of hammered platinum. He was old by the standards of his species, and he was tired by the standards of his own long career, and he had already decided that this afternoon would be a bureaucratic formality. The manifest said the biped was a defaulted contract laborer. The manifest said the biped had never killed anything larger than a lakefish. The manifest, Ves Otran had assured him quietly on the way in, was correct in every particular. The manifest was a lie. Ves Otrun had forged it himself 3 sector turns earlier in a private terminal 1 deck below the tithe vault. He had rewritten Pete Molnar's file after Ambassador Lazeri, a translucent-throated Vosari princess with hair like slow water, had made a request no one in the Grand Chamberlain's office had refused a Vosari princess in 11 generations. She had needed a distraction. She had needed a distraction badly enough to sacrifice a warm body. She had not chosen Pete Molnar because she disliked him. She had chosen him because for the 6 sector turns he had escorted her ship, quiet, competent, mopping the halls in the graveyard shift, saluting when he passed her cousin's guards, saying "ma'am" to her handmaids. No one had ever counted him. He was the man you did not count. He was, in the polite language of court intelligence, invisible baggage, the sort of thing you leave behind so the assassins get the wrong scent. She had not told him he was to be the bait. She had told him he was to help escort a shipment of ceremonial rice from Bay 9 to the Grand Chamberlain's kitchen. Pete had nodded once, said "yes, ma'am," and gone to get his cart. When the servitors instead led him at the 3rd bulkhead into the arena's undertunnel and locked the door behind him, he had not shouted. He had set the bucket down. He had looked at the tungsten pry bar in his hand. He had thought, very briefly, of the frozen apartment on Zenith Street, where Rhoda would already be asleep with the little dog on her feet and the radiator still ticking, and then he had walked out onto the blue sand because his other choice was to sit down and wait. Vesotron leaned toward Krethval on the mid-tier bench. His pale, second voice's tongue flicked out and tasted the air with the small, satisfied twitch of a courtier watching a debt collect. "Champion," Vesotron said softly, "do us the kindness of a brief entertainment." Krethval did not turn. His eyes were on the biped's shoulders. Something in the way the round-eared thing set his feet in the sand, heels planted, weight low, the bar held loose across the thigh rather than clenched at the hip, snagged for a moment on the champion's attention. Then the biped hoisted the mop bucket up onto his hip, tipped it, and calmly poured its dirty grey water in a wide, wet ring around himself. Krethval frowned. The frown was small. It was the smallest frown he had made in 100 duels. "What is he doing?" Vesotron murmured. Krethval did not answer. He did not know. Pete straightened. He kicked the empty bucket to one side and settled the pry bar into a two-handed grip low across his belly. The wet ring around him steamed in the arena lights. The arena announcer, a mechanical throat that made every sentence sound like the beginning of a funeral, introduced the first hound in the cadence of a bored priest. Arena hound, plasma augmented, class 3, kill order. The gate cracked. The first hound came out. And arena hound was not properly a dog. It was something a Vosari geneticist had grown 73 cycles ago by braiding lizard cartilage over crocodile jaws and welding a plasma augmentation collar into the base of its skull. It had 6 legs, 4 eyes, no lips, and a set of forward-angled claws that ignited into a lilac plasma envelope the instant the collar registered aggression. It weighed 900 pounds. It could take a head off a saber champion in one lunge. Krethval had killed 11 of them in his early years, mostly by outrunning them and driving the blade in from behind. He had, in the last decade, refused every contract that included them because he thought the collar was cruel. The hound came in low and fast, the plasma envelope on its claws throwing lilac light across the sand. Pete did not run. Pete did not scream. Pete stepped forward into the swing. Every experienced observer in the arena, Krethval included, saw the step and understood, in the half-second before the collision, that the biped was making the wrong choice. You did not step into a plasma hound. You went sideways, or you went low, or you went under, and if you had no sword, you died. The biped stepped in. The pry bar came up in a short, two-handed thrust that had no elegance in it, and no ceremony, and no name in any martial catalogue Krethval knew. The bar's flat chisel end punched through the seam under the hound's lower jaw, where the neck plate hinged into the throat plate. Pete Molnar had, in 12 winters welding hull, learned that armor of any kind, organic or steel, had one true weakness, and that weakness was a hinge. He put his whole weight on the bar and pulled down. The hound's jaw came off. The animal folded like wet cardboard. Silence. There were 38,000 spectators in the arena tiers. None of them made a sound for 4 seconds. Krethval, who had watched every kind of fool die in every kind of way, felt his main plates begin of their own accord to rise. "Vesotron," he said without turning. "What did the manifest say?" "Sanitation liability class 4, the second voice whispered. "And his combat record?" "None, champion. None catalogued." Krethval was quiet. He was very quiet. On the blue sand below, the biped had already stepped out of the pool of hound blood and was walking calmly to the edge of his wet ring. He set the tungsten bar upright between his boots. He looked up into the tiers, not at Krethval, but slightly to Krethval's right, and he raised one broad hand. He extended one finger. "That's one," he said. In flat Midwestern English, the translator carried up into the balconies with a slight delay. "Of 8. The Count landed on Ves Otran like a cold stone dropped into a bath. He felt his inner lip go tight against his teeth. He did not know why. It was only a number. It was only a small, warm-blooded thing on the sand, and it had only just now made an obvious noise. He looked out of long habit at the champion beside him. Crethval's main plates were fully raised. The champion's slow, yellow eyes had gone still in the way they went still before he took the saber out of the sheath. "He is counting," Crethval said quietly. "Why is he counting?" "Champion, it is nothing, champion. He does not know how many there are. He is bluffing." "He knows there are 8, said Crethval. "The gates on this level are numbered. He read the numbers on the way in." Ves Otran opened his mouth to answer, and did not. On the sand, the second gate had cracked. The second hound came out faster than the first. It came out crooked, the way trained ones came out when they had smelled the blood of the first, and it came in with its head low and its jaw already open. Pete did not step forward this time. Pete stepped sideways. The hound's shoulder ploughed through the wet ring. The water had steamed to a thin salt paste now, and the hound's front foot slipped 1/4 of a foot on the paste, and Pete's bar came in from the outside, in a low, hard, chopping blow that went in behind the ear where the augmentation collar bolted to the skull. He had this time hooked the flat chisel end under the collar's mount. He put his weight on the bar the way a man puts his weight on the end of a wrecking crowbar, and he snapped the collar out of the bone with a wet, tearing crack the arena heard from the highest tier. The collar's plasma envelope, freed from its mount, discharged sideways into the hound's own throat. The hound dropped, hissing, its throat cauterized shut from the inside. Silence again. Longer this time. Pete Molnar stepped out of the mess. He raised 2 fingers. He said, "That's 2. Ves Otran's tongue was in his own inner lip, and he tasted copper. Copper was the color and smell of Vosari blood. He had bitten through the delicate flesh under his teeth without noticing. "Champion," he said. His voice cracked. "There has been an administrative error. If you would permit a recess—" "No," said Crethval. "The human is clearly not what the manifest describes." "No," said Crethval. "The human is precisely what the manifest describes. The manifest is the lie." "Be quiet," second voice, "before I tell the chamberlain who signed it." Ves Otran went silent. His tongue found the wet, raw place in his own mouth and stayed there. Down on the balcony's rim, in a private box hung with pale, silver-blue silks, Ambassador Lizeri watched with her long, translucent throat, perfectly still. She had come to the arena precisely because she had needed to be seen at the arena. The whole point of the arrangement had been to place her under 200 noble witnesses at the exact hour her cousin's assassins were storming an empty guest suite 4 decks up. Her cousin, First Nail Viera, had wanted her dead. Viera had put 6 knives into the flagship. Viera had never once, in all her scheming, considered that Lizeri might slip her own bodyguard and place the bait somewhere no one would look. The bait had been Pete. Pete had been, in the ambassador's own private evaluation, the most efficient possible distraction. A warm human body, 39 years old, contract expiration in 19 days, no next of kin listed on the Imperium form. She had not read his file past the summary. She had never read a janitor's file past the summary. No one did. Now she watched Pete Molnar raise a 3rd finger over a 3rd dead hound. She had not moved from the moment the first gate opened. Her cousin's assassins were, at that moment, being very quietly slaughtered 4 decks up by a Vosari counter-team she had hired with her own tithe purse. And the Imperium Security Office would, in about 11 minutes, receive a full recording of it under her own seal. That part of her plan was going perfectly. That part of her plan had never depended on the janitor surviving. It had also never depended on the janitor being visible on 97 arena feeds while he did impossible things with a tungsten bar. Lazeri's long fingers came together very slowly in her lap and did not part again. The third hound had died the way the second had died, only faster because Pete had begun to notice that the collars sat differently on the smaller animals and adjusted his angle by a quarter turn. He had welded enough hull plate to know instinctively how to angle a chisel against a bad seam. He worked the same way he had worked in the yard on Rice Point, standing hip-deep in a January that took a man's fingers off if he was slow. He did not talk while he worked. He did not shout. He did not curse. He set the bar. He hooked the seam. He pulled. Between kills he wiped the bar on his own thigh so the grip stayed clean. The court began to lean forward. Ves Otran looked down at his hands and saw that they were shaking. "Champion," he tried again. "I did not, that is, the ambassador's clerk provided the file. I merely—" "You wagered 3 tithe worlds," said Krethval, without looking at him. "I heard you at the vault." "Champion, be quiet." The Grand Chamberlain, a long, white-crested old male, who had presided over 400 years of court intrigue, with the resigned expression of a man watching a tide come in, folded his ceremonial fan and set it on his knee. He did not speak. He was watching the human. He was, more particularly, watching the human count. The fourth hound was larger than the first 3. It was a breeding male marked with a lilac ident plate on the shoulder, and its collar was welded, not clipped. Pete could not get the chisel under the mount. The hound clipped him on the way past, and Pete went to one knee on the wet salt paste. Blood ran down the outside of his left thigh in a bright, thin ribbon. The crowd made its first real sound of the afternoon, an inhalation, the collective drawing of 38,000 throats. Krethval, on the bench above, went very still. Pete stood up. He did not check the wound. He shifted the bar to the other hand, backed one step, and let the hound come in for the second pass. This time, when it reached him, he did not go for the collar. He went for the eye. The pry bar went in through the second eye of the outside cluster and out through the back of the skull in a single motion, and Pete let go of it and stepped away and let the hound run itself out. The hound made it 4 paces and fell. Pete walked to the corpse. He put a boot on the skull, wrenched the bar free, wiped it on his thigh above the cut, and lifted 4 fingers to the balcony. 4, he said. He did not smile. He had not smiled at any of the 4. Ves Otran's tongue in his own lip was tasting copper more freely now. He tried, once, to think about how many tithe worlds he had actually agreed to pay. He gave up. He tried once to think about the size of the fine the Imperium levied on second voices who forged manifest documents. He gave up. He tried once to think of a reason he could give the Grand Chamberlain, seated 10 paces away, for why this was happening. He gave up. Krethval spoke to the balcony page. "Bring me the true dossier," said the champion. "Not the manifest, the Imperium intake file, the medical scan, the customs deep file, all of it." The page bowed and ran. On the sand, gates 5 and 6 opened simultaneously. The arena director had made the executive decision to accelerate. 2 hounds came out at once. Pete Molnar looked at them, looked up at the balcony, and shrugged. The shrug was so small it barely showed under the coveralls, but every animal-eyed noble in the tier read it, and it was that shrug, not the 4 kills, that first made Ves Otran understand he was going to die on this balcony before nightfall. The 2 hounds split, coming at Pete from either side, the way trained pack animals split. Pete stepped forward, not back, and cut the angle so that the 2 lines of attack crossed each other. He had, 12 years earlier, learned to work under 2 overhead cranes, moving simultaneously in the yard on Rice Point. You did not stand still. You stood where their arcs would collide before they reached you. The 2 hounds converged. Pete slid the bar down along the outside line of the left one, hooked its front foot, and dragged it in one hard yank across the path of the right one. The right hound's plasma-augmented claws went, at 900 pounds of muscle behind them, straight through the left hound's chest. Pete kept moving. He came up on the right hound's shoulder as it hesitated, dragged the bar's chisel through the throat seam, and stepped clear before the corpse fell. He raised 5 fingers, and then a 6th. He said, 5, 6. The Grand Chamberlain's fan tapped once on his knee. It was the smallest possible sound. Every attendant in the balcony understood it as the sound of a court verdict being drafted in the old male's head. Creth Val rose from the bench. He did not draw the saber yet. He stood at the rail. He watched the human on the sand. "Ves Otran," said the champion without looking away. "Champion?" The true dossier. The page had come running back with a slate. Ves Otran took it because the page's protocol dictated that a second voice must take a document before the champion, and Ves Otran's hands were shaking so much that the slate slipped and skidded across the polished floor toward Creth Val's boot. Creth Val picked it up. He read. He read slowly, the way a champion reads before a duel, moving his slow yellow eyes down each line. He read the customs entry. He read the shipyard record. He read the Imperium medical intake. When he reached the second page of the medical intake, he stopped. "Read it aloud," he said to Ves Otran. "Champion, I read it aloud so the Chamberlain can hear." Ves Otran's tongue was thick in his mouth. He took the slate. He read, "Subject Molnar, Peter Anthony, age 39 standard, origin North American continent, planet Terra, city catalogued as Duluth. Height 1.78 standard units, weight 88 standard units, medical anomalies of note." He stopped. "Continue," said Creth Val. Ves Otran's tongue found his lip. It was bleeding again. Bone density, 3.1 times Imperium warm blood mean. Marked as structural anomaly. Disregard. Muscle attachment ratio, 2.4 times mean. Marked as anomaly. Disregard. Pulmonary volume, adjusted for planetary gravity of 1.0. Native gravity of subject's continent recorded as 1.0 standard, sea level. Cold tolerance. Subject documented as capable of maintained physical labor at -25 standard temperature units for shift periods of 8 to 10 hours. Cross-referenced against welding contract number 77243A. Great Lakes region, 12 consecutive winters. He stopped. "Continue," said Creth Val. "Prior kinetic exposure, 3 documented industrial collapses. Subject survived. In one incident, reference 19 years prior, subject, then a minor of 11 years, entered a partially collapsed rolling mill structure to retrieve trapped adult workers. Retrieved living 3, retrieved deceased 7. Subject sustained a spinal compression fracture, self-reported after 8 days. The Chamberlain's fan tapped again. Ves Otran read on. He could not stop. His voice had gone thin as a bone flute. Skill catalogue, fusion welding, arc welding, plasma cutting, vehicular operation up to class 4, small arms proficiency, unrated, melee weapon proficiency, unrated. Note by intake officer, subject declined melee assessment on grounds of waste of everybody's time. Recommendation of intake officer, classify subject as sanitation liability class 4 to conceal anomaly readings from foreign customs. Ves Otran stopped again. He looked up. Recommendation approved, he read, by order of second voice Ves Otran. The Chamberlain closed his fan. Creth Val turned at last from the rail. "You knew," he said. Ves Otran's mouth moved. Nothing came out. "You knew what he was," said the champion, "and you told me he was a janitor." Champion, I did not. The anomalies are common, they mean nothing." "They mean," said Creth Val quietly, "that he was raised in one gravity precisely at the mean of my own homeworld. in a climate that would kill any Vosari courtier in 11 minutes, doing work that requires him to move against loads 80 times his mass every day of his adult life. It means he is, by any Imperium standard I have ever read, catalogued as a warm-blooded siege engine. It means the reason he did not run at the first arena hound is that he has spent his life inside falling steel, and this looked to him like a small day. Vesotron said nothing. It also means, said the champion, that I told my attendant to toss him a maintenance bar, which was the worst weapon I could have possibly given him, because it is precisely the tool he has held in his hand every day for 12 winters. He looked down at the sand. Pete had raised a 7th finger. 7, he said. He said it flat. He said it without any color at all. He was leaning on the bar now. There was blood on his coveralls in 2 places. The cut on his thigh had darkened his pant leg from the hip down, and the second bright line was low across his ribs. He had been clipped somewhere in the 6th kill. He was breathing hard. Krethval, who had stood on that sand under similar breath, understood that the human had perhaps 11 minutes of usable strength left. It was, he thought, admirable that the human did not know how to lie about it. The human was leaning on the bar because the bar was easier to lean on than to hold up. Champion, Vesotron tried one last time. There is one hound left. Let it finish him. It is done. It cost us nothing. The wager. You wagered 3 tithe worlds against a warm-blooded siege engine you had personally catalogued and personally concealed, said Krethval. And you now propose to me that the honor of my house be paid off with the death of the man you cheated. Champion, silence, second voice. Krethval put a hand on the platinum sheath of the windbone saber. He did not draw yet. The 8th gate cracked. The 8th hound was the flight leader of the pack. It came out slow. It had watched all 7 of its companions die. It was not, in the Vosari geneticists' records, a fully sentient animal, but it had enough of a hindbrain to have learned that the biped in the ring was, in the animal sense, a stop sign. It circled Pete twice. Pete did not chase it. Pete braced the bar in the sand and waited. When the hound came in, it came in low from behind. The only angle from which Pete's blind side was exposed. Pete had been waiting for it. He turned inside the arc, planted the bar butt in the sand as a pivot, and swung his own body around the pole the way a shipyard rigger swung around a mooring post in a cross-current. The hound's plasma claws grazed the pole and did not touch Pete. Pete came out of the pivot with the bar in a 2-handed downward hammer that took the hound above the eyes and drove the animal's skull, plasma collar and all into the sand. The plasma collar shorted against the wet salt paste under the sand. The hound seized once, twice, and lay still. Pete stepped back. He was breathing very hard now. He raised 8 fingers. He did not speak. The court was, for the first time in 300 years, in perfect silence. Krethval drew the windbone saber. The sound of it clearing the platinum sheath, a soft, cold, singing note the Vosari called wind in empty bone, was the only sound in the arena for a long moment. He unfastened his ceremonial overcape and let it fall on the bench. He unbuckled the neck frill and set it aside. He walked to the balcony stair and he went down it slowly, the way he always went down it, with the saber held 2-handed and the point trailing behind him. Vesotron watched him go. Then Vesotron looked, for the first time in 3 hours, at the private silk-hung box where Ambassador Lazeri sat with her long throat still. Her eyes found his. She smiled. It was a small smile. It was a smile that told Vesotron quite plainly that she had a full recording of him at the tithe vault, forging a manifest, and that in the morning, when she filed her cousin's assassination attempt as attempted regicide, she would file his forgery alongside it as a parallel court exhibit. She would file it because she now knew, 3 hours later than she should have, that the janitor was not a warm-blooded distraction. He was a witness. He had, according to her contract, escorted her ship for 6 sector turns, which meant he was legally her retainer, which meant an attempt on his life on her escort duty was, under Vosari code, an attempt on her house. He would not need to survive the arena for her to weaponize him against Viera and against Ves Otran both. He only needed to have been on the manifest. Ves Otran sat down very slowly on the bench. He put his tongue in his mouth, and this time he closed his teeth on it hard enough to draw the blood he had, without meaning to, been leaking for the last hour. He held it there. He hoped the pain would organize his thoughts. It did not. Down on the sand, the champion arrived. The champion Krethval was 6.5 feet tall in his boots. His main plates were fully raised, gold lacquered in the arena light. He stopped at the outside of the wet salt ring. He inclined his head, a bare fraction, and set the windbone saber on guard. "Human," he said. His voice in the translator came out low and slow. "I did not draw for you. That was a mistake. I draw now." Pete Molnar, standing in the middle of the ring with a bent tungsten bar in a bloody grip, looked up at the champion. Sweat had matted his short brown hair to his forehead. His left leg was slick with blood down to the boot. His breath was going in short, measured wheezes. "That's fine," Pete said. "I got no problem with you." "You have no problem with me. You didn't sign the manifest." Krethval was quiet. "Then why do you fight?" said the champion at last. "Because I got a sister at home," Pete said. "Her birthday is in 8 days. She asked me to be there." The champion tilted his head. "That," he said quietly, "is why you count." "That's why I count. How many days at the start?" 8. "And now?" 8, said Pete Molnar. "Only the count was hounds, not days. The days I keep in my head." Krethval, who had killed 312 creatures in ritual combat, looked at the round-eared biped in the coveralls and understood, in the small, quiet way champions come to understandings, that in 312 duels he had never fought anyone who had a reason to live that was not, in some quiet way, a reason to die well. The biped had a sister. The biped had a birthday. The biped was not counting to be brave. The biped was counting because 8 was a manageable number, and manageable numbers were how he had survived every previous impossible morning of his life. "Then, human," said Krethval, "let us not waste your day." He came in. The windbone saber was a 2-handed curved blade, the length of Pete's leg. It moved faster than Pete moved. Pete knew that. Pete had watched the champion practice once in the aft training bay from behind a mop bucket. Pete had counted the champion's swings then too, without meaning to. He had counted 6 per breath. He was therefore not surprised when the first swing came in a half-second faster than he could get the bar all the way up. The saber skimmed the outside of his forearm. The bar came up. Saber and bar clashed with a bell note that rang the arena. Krethval was surprised by the note. Windbone was supposed to shear common metals. Windbone had sheared common metals for 11 generations. Windbone had not sheared this. Krethval recovered, spun, brought the saber down again. Pete caught the second swing on the flat of the bar, angled it, and let it slide past his shoulder into the sand. He did not have the strength to countercut. He was, in that moment, only shaping the fight. He was a welder shaping a bad seam. He wanted the champion angled a certain way. The third swing came. Pete stepped into it. The saber took him across the top of the left wrist and broke it. The break made a sound like a green branch parting. Pete grunted. He did not drop the bar. He shifted it entirely to his right hand. Krethval saw the break happen. He saw the human refuse to drop the bar. He respected the refusal. He came in for a killing thrust. Pete slipped inside the thrust and jammed the bar's chisel end up under the champion's underplate at the ribs. The bar did not go in. The underplate was designed for exactly this. The bar bent. Pete grunted again, tore it free, and stepped back 3 paces. Krethval, who had never in his career been touched at the ribs, understood In the small, quiet way champions come to understandings, that the biped had picked the exact angle a welder would pick to lift a truck axle off a stripped bolt. It was not a killing angle. It was a lifting angle. The biped had not been trying to kill him. The biped had been testing his underplate for the weakest hinge. Crethval did him the courtesy of not commenting. They circled. Pete's left arm hung. His breath was worse. The saber traced small figure eights in the arena air. "You will die," said Crethval quietly, "before you finish this. You know that." "Maybe," said Pete. "Not maybe, certainly." "Then it costs you nothing," said Pete, "to let me try." Crethval, in 312 duels, had never been asked for such a small mercy in such a small voice. He said, "Try." They came together for the fourth exchange. The fourth was the one that cost Pete a rib. The saber came in low along the right side, and Pete twisted. And the point went between his fifth and sixth ribs. And Pete twisted harder to trap the blade under his own arm. The saber stuck. He had, in that instant, 5 inches of ancient wind-forged blade lodged inside his own ribcage, and the champion's 2 hands on the hilt 3 feet away. Any Vasari swordsman in the tiers would have told him he was already dead. He was not. He drove the bar up along the outside of the champion's leading forearm, along the seam of the arm plate, the hinge, and levered. He levered, as if he were prying a hood off a rusted engine block. The arm plate popped at the shoulder. Crethval roared. It was the first sound the champion had made in the fight. The saber came free of Pete's ribs with a wet drag. Pete staggered back, took 2 steps sideways, and coughed a bright arc of blood across the salt paste. He was still on his feet. He was not sure why he was still on his feet. He shifted the bar into his good hand and stood in the wet ring with the windbone saber's imprint bleeding out of his side, and did not fall. The champion, holding his shoulder together with his free hand, straightened and looked at him across the sand. He looked at him for a long, slow moment. "How?" Crethval said. Pete had to work at the answer. The blood was in his throat. "Bar's tungsten," he said. "Saber's harder, but the seam under your arm plate's just a hinge. Every hinge got a hinge point. Push at the hinge, hinges give. It's how bars work." "That is not," said Crethval, "a duelist's answer." "No, sir," said Pete. "It's a welder's answer." Crethval considered this. His arm plate was hanging by 2 straps. Blood was moving down his side in a slow, warm sheet under the blackened brass. The pain was, he thought, informative. "You are not invincible," said Crethval. "No, sir. You bleed, you break, you die." "Yes, sir. Then how do you win, human?" Pete Molnar, standing in a wet ring of salt paste on the blue sand of the Azaran of 9 rings, with a broken wrist and a lost rib, and 8 dead hounds around him, spat blood off to one side and got a better grip on the bar with his one good hand. "We ain't invincible," he said. "We bleed, we break, we die. We just make the other guy die faster." Crethval, 312 times a champion, closed his eyes for 1 full second. Then he opened them, and he came in. The 5th exchange was the last one. Crethval came in high. He was a 2-handed swordsman by tradition. He was, in the wounded moment, a 1-handed swordsman by necessity, holding the saber in his intact arm and shielding his broken shoulder with the ruined arm. He came in high because Pete was leaning slightly forward with the bar and Pete's guard was low. A high cut would take Pete's neck. A high cut was the correct choice. Pete let the cut come. He did not raise the bar to block it. He could not have blocked a downward saber cut with a bent bar even at full strength. He had, in a fraction of a second, done the math. He stepped inside the cut instead. The blade skimmed the top of his skull and took a long strip of scalp with it. Pete did not feel it. Pete drove the bent tungsten bar, still hot from the last blow, up between the champion's ribs, under the loose underplate, along the seam he had already opened with the 4th exchange. The bar went in, It went in deep. It went in through the underplate. It went in through the ribs. It went in through the pale, slow-furred muscle Crethval called a heart in his own throat-click tongue, and Pete called a heart in his own English. It went in until Pete's fist hit the outside of the champion's rib cage. Crethval stopped. The windbone saber trembled in his hand. The point drifted down and rested on the sand. He did not fall. Champions of his line did not fall. They stood a long moment before they went to their knees, because it was traditional and because standing was the last discipline. He stood. Pete stood too. He was leaning on the bar because the bar was through the champion's ribs, and the champion's ribs were holding it up. His left arm hung useless. His right side was black. They looked at each other over the length of a tungsten pry bar buried in a two-hearted chest. "Human," said Crethval. His voice was very small. "Why? Why did you count?" "I told you," said Pete. "Sister asked me home." "How many days?" "8. And now?" "8. You did not lose a day." "No, sir." "Then go home, human," said the champion of the Asaran of 9 rings, and he sank at last to his knees on the blue sand in perfect quiet, and he was dead before his shoulder plate touched the ground. Pete Molnar pulled the bar free. He did it slowly. He did it the way you pulled a bolt free of a lifted axle when you did not want to lose the head. The bar came out clean. The champion's blood came out with it in a hot, slow wash across Pete's boots. Pete stepped out of the wash. He wiped the bar on his own thigh above the cut. He held it upright between his boots and stood breathing for a long moment while the arena stared. Somewhere in the highest tier, one voice, a Vosari attendant high and shaking, began the low 3-note keen the Vosari sang for a fallen champion. Another voice took it up. Another. By the time Pete Molnar had begun to climb the balcony stairs, half the arena was keening. He did not climb fast. He climbed one step at a time, his good hand on the bar and his broken hand tucked under his coverall for support. He left a wet trail on the stair. He did not look up until he was on the last landing. When he looked up, he was looking at Ves Otran. The second voice of the Grand Chamberlain was standing. He was standing because his legs had refused to keep him seated. He was pressed against the back wall of the balcony. His pale second voice's tongue was flicking rapidly between his teeth, testing for the blood he was leaking. His hands were open at his sides, palm out, in the Vosari courtier's posture of a man asking for mercy without saying the word. Pete Molnar looked at him. Pete did not speak. Pete crossed the balcony, past the empty champion's bench, past the astonished attendants, past the Grand Chamberlain. The old white-crested male did not rise, did not speak, did not lift his fan. His fan lay closed on his knee and would stay closed. And Pete would find out later that the fan being closed at the death of a champion was, in Vosari court law, an invitation to a claimant to speak, and stopped in front of Ves Otran. He did not say anything. He set the tungsten pry bar across Ves Otran's throat. He did not press. He only set it. He held the bent bar horizontally across the courtier's slender neck with one hand and let the weight of the bar rest on the bruised windpipe. The second voice's tongue stopped flicking. His eyes went wide, went pink at the edges, and did not blink. Pete Molnar looked past him. He looked at the Grand Chamberlain. He waited. The old male's fan was closed. Pete cleared his throat. He tasted blood. "Sir," he said in flat Midwestern English, the balcony translator carried up through the ceiling and out across the arena. "I'd like to speak." The Grand Chamberlain, who in 400 years of court intrigue had watched every possible kind of noble and every possible kind of assassin and every possible kind of ambassador ask permission to speak, inclined his head. The inclination was small. It was, in his tongue, a full, formal grant. "Speak, human," he said. "This one," Pete said, indicating Ves Otran with a small nod of the bar. "Put a doctored manifest in front of your champion. He knew what I was. He wrote it out. He hid it. He bet on it." The Grand Chamberlain did not answer. "Your champion," Pete said, and his voice cracked once and steadied, was a straight man. I got nothing bad to say about your champion. Your champion came down and asked me why I counted. Your champion asked me my question. I answered him plain. I don't owe your house nothing more. The Grand Chamberlain inclined his head again. This one, Pete said. I owe. Ves Otran made a small sound in his own throat. Don't kill him, said the Grand Chamberlain quietly. Pete looked at the old male. He waited. I ask it of you as a favor, human, said the Grand Chamberlain, not as an order. I do not have the standing in this hour to give you an order, but I ask it as a favor. I have use of him. If you kill him, his tongue dies with him, and I have 400 years of use I would like to make of his tongue before he is quiet. Do not kill him. Pete looked down at the second voice. He was silent a long moment. All right, Pete said, but he don't sit in the second chair no more. He does not, agreed the Grand Chamberlain. Pete Molnar lifted the tungsten pry bar away from Ves Otran's throat. He set the butt of it on the balcony floor and leaned on it. He looked down at his own boots. Blood was pooling in a small, careful puddle around the left one. He noted, with the detached professionalism of a man who had worked 12 winters on hull plate, that the puddle was still growing. He noted, with the same detached professionalism, that the growing was slowing. He was not going to bleed out on the balcony. He might, if he did not sit down soon, faint on it. He preferred not to faint. He turned to the Grand Chamberlain. Sir, he said, if it's not too much trouble. Speak, human. I would like a cup of coffee, said Pete Molnar. The real kind, not the reconstituted kind you got on this ship. And I would like a shuttle home. The Grand Chamberlain's white crest moved. It was, on his species, a small nod. You will have both, he said. An attendant to the Grand Chamberlain, who had been standing behind the old male's chair for 11 years and had never in that time been ordered to fetch coffee for a human, bowed and left the balcony at a run. Pete leaned harder on the bar. He looked up, and his eyes met the eyes of Ambassador Lazeri across the arena in her silk-hung private box, and he understood without needing anyone to tell him exactly what she had done and exactly why she had done it and exactly how she was right now filing the papers that would make him a legally protected witness for the rest of his natural life. Her long, translucent throat moved once. She inclined her head to him. It was, in her species court, the salute a princess gave a sword-bearer. Pete Molnar did not salute back. He was too tired. He did, however, meet her eyes for a full 4 count. Then he looked away. The Grand Chamberlain rose. The old male rose slowly, as very old males of any species rose, and he unhooked from his belt a thing Pete did not recognize, but the whole balcony did, a small platinum sheath, oiled and hammered, the platinum sheath of the windbone saber. He had walked across the balcony while Pete was looking at the ambassador. He had, without ceremony, retrieved the saber from the sand by way of a lower stair. He held it now, in the sheath, in both hands. Human, he said, and he offered it. Pete looked at the saber, he looked at the sheath, he looked at the old male's crested face. No, thank you, he said. He said it gently. I appreciate the offer. The Grand Chamberlain did not lower the saber. It is, he said, the trophy of the honest kill. Under our law, it is yours. Sir, said Pete Molnar, I don't want to be rude, but I don't lift nothing I ain't willing to sweep up after, and I don't wash windows. The Grand Chamberlain looked at him a long moment. Then slowly, the old male's white crest moved again, and his tongue clicked once in what the balcony understood as the smallest permissible laugh at court. As you wish, human, he said, and lowered the saber. Pete Molnar, who had that afternoon killed 8 arena hounds and a champion in ritual combat, with a tungsten pry bar for the 11.80 per hour maintenance wage the Imperium had contracted him for, sat down at last on the empty champion's bench because his legs would not hold him. An attendant brought a medic. The medic was Vasari and afraid, but the medic knew field work. She opened Pete's coverall, saw the rib wound, stopped the bleeding with a foam that hissed and set. She set his wrist. She stapled his scalp. She sprayed his thigh. She worked quickly. She worked for a Vasari medic on a court balcony with unusual professional silence. When she finished, Pete stood up. He stood by leaning on the tungsten bar. He wobbled, and he did not fall. Another attendant brought a small ceramic cup. The cup was not Imperium coffee. Imperium coffee was a pale, reconstituted brown that tasted to Pete like the water at the bottom of an old thermos. The cup in the attendant's hand was black. It steamed. It smelled faintly of a burnt, roasted Terran bean. Pete looked at it. Pete looked at the attendant. "Where," he said, "did you find this?" The attendant, who was young and had a nervous crest, bowed. "The Grand Chamberlain," she said, "keeps a private stock from Terra. He was told it was medicinal. He has never had occasion before this day to serve it to a human." Pete took the cup. He took a small, careful sip. He closed his eyes. He had not tasted real coffee in 19 months. "Please tell him thank you," Pete said without opening his eyes. The attendant bowed and left. Pete drank his coffee slowly. He drank the whole cup. He was still leaning on the bar. He was still bleeding a little at the wrist under the medic's brace. He was, more importantly, tired in a way that a man is tired only 3 or 4 times in a life, and he wanted very badly to be on a ship going home. When the shuttle came, it came fast. Lazzeri had, unbeknownst to Pete, arranged the shuttle before Pete had killed the second hound. She had had a Vasari corvette standing off the aft dock since the afternoon's first hour. She had done it, she would tell no one, because she had for the last 3 hours felt in a very quiet part of herself the small human word she did not have a Vasari equivalent for. The human word was ashamed. She had not felt ashamed at what she had done to her cousin. She had felt ashamed at what she had done to Pete Molnar. She had, in that quiet 3 hours, decided quietly that the shuttle would be waiting for him, and that when it came, she would not be on it. He had been a distraction. He was owed the courtesy, at least, of not being made a trophy. She would file the case against Vera in the morning. She would file the case against Ves Otran beside it. She would win both. Her cousin would be exiled, and Ves Otran would be reduced to the 10th chair, and the Grand Chamberlain would speak with her privately at some quiet hour, and would ask her a small question about a small janitor from a small city, and she would answer him plain. That was all in the morning. Right now the shuttle came. Pete Molnar walked to the shuttle. He walked slowly. He carried the mop bucket in his good hand and the tungsten pry bar under his broken arm. The mop was still in the bucket. He did not leave the mop behind. It was Imperium property. It was, he thought, wrong to leave Imperium property in an arena. At the gate he paused. He looked back at the balcony one time. Ves Otran was still standing against the wall. His pale second voice's tongue was still tucked in his own lip. His eyes met Pete's for a half-second. Pete Molnar did not smile. He nodded once, small. It was the small nod a shipyard welder gave at the end of a long day to another welder he did not particularly like but had worked beside. It was not forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. Then he walked out of the arena. The arena camera in the high dome recorded, in its final frame before the feed cut for the day, what would later become the single most viewed image in the archive of the Asaran of 9 Rings. A mop bucket, empty of water, a bent tungsten pry bar laid across the mouth of the bucket, and arranged beside them the severed crest of the champion Kreth Val, set upright in the sand the way a janitor arranges the last of the trash he has finished with. 2 attendants would remove the crest and the bar and the bucket in the small hours of the morning. Neither attendant would speak to each other while they did it. No one on the flagship would speak of the image again for many years. though every noble who saw it would remember for the rest of their lives the small, quiet lesson it had taught them, which was that in the count of any warm-blooded thing, the number you do not count is the number that ends you. On the shuttle, Pete Molnar slept. He slept through the docking with the Vosari corvette. He slept through the corvette's slow burn out of the flagship's escort ring. He slept through the corvette's captain's careful and formal address, transmitted 3 times over the shuttle intercom, thanking him on behalf of the ambassador for services rendered. He did not hear it. He was, at that hour, dreaming of Rice Point in January and the smell of a shipyard heater and a small girl in a red coat waving at him from a snowbank. The small girl was Rhoda at 9. She was calling to him about a dog they had once had. He was answering her without words. The corvette laid in a course for Terra. The course was fast. The captain had orders, from a source neither Pete nor the flight crew ever formally identified, to arrive in the Duluth port on the 6th of 8 days, with 2 days of Pete's schedule to spare. The captain kept the schedule. On the 6th day, Pete Molnar walked off a Vasari corvette onto the tarmac of the Duluth Municipal Spaceport with a mop bucket in one hand and a bent tungsten pry bar under his arm and his other arm in a brace. The wind off Lake Superior tasted of copper and cold iron and the faint, sweet chemical bite of the winter road salt. He set the bucket down on the tarmac. He set the bar down beside it. He took a long, slow breath. Somewhere across the field, he heard a car door open and shut. Rhoda Molnar had come to the port to pick him up because the port cabs cost money, and she was Rhoda and had a driver's license and did not, on principle, waste a fare. She came across the tarmac with her hair down under a knit hat, in a black coat, in her sensible boots, and she looked at Pete a long moment before she said anything. She was 32. She was 5'4". She had, on their dead mother's side, the same broad, short-boned build as her brother, and on their long-dead father's side, the same still grey-green eyes. She looked at his broken wrist. She looked at his stapled scalp. She looked at the coverall stiff with the salt paste of the arena. She looked at the pry bar on the tarmac. "Peter," she said, "what in the name of God happened to you?" Pete Molnar looked at his sister. He picked the tungsten bar back up. He tucked it under his good arm. He hoisted the mop bucket in his good hand. He started walking with her toward the parking lot. "Nothing much," he said. "Long shift." "Long shift," she said. "Yeah." She looked at him sideways. She had learned 32 years earlier when to let a Molnar man talk and when to let him not talk. She was not going to ask again today. She was going to feed him. She had a small pot of chili in the apartment on Zenith Street, and she had bought a cheap sponge cake with pink frosting because it was going to be, in 2 days, her birthday. "Missed you," she said instead. "Missed you too." They reached the car. Pete opened the passenger door with his good hand. He set the bucket down in the footwell. He set the bar across the top of the bucket. He stood a second in the open door in the cold air, and he looked back once across the tarmac at the corvette, at the sleek, pale bulk of the Vosari craft crouched on the icy landing pad, with its running lights soft blue in the falling dusk, and he did not wave. He got in the car. Rhoda pulled out of the port lot. She drove north up the icy interstate toward the apartment on Zenith Street, where the pipes always groaned when the temperature dropped, and the little dog they had adopted after their mother died would already be at the front door, ears up, waiting for the sound of the car in the lot. Rhoda's little dog was named Toaster because he was the color of one and roughly the same shape. Pete had always liked Toaster. They drove in silence a long way. "Pete," Rhoda said finally. "Yeah. Was it bad?" Pete looked out the passenger window at the frozen lake going past below the highway. "It was a shift," he said. "That's all it was. It was a long shift." She let him have that. They drove home. 6 days later, On the 9th day since Pete had first stepped onto the blue sand of the Asaran of Nine Rings, in the Grand Chamberlain's private balcony library, 4 decks above the arena, the old white-crested male finished reading the arena's final report and set it down on the low table beside him. Ambassador Lazeri, in her silver-blue court silks, sat across from him with her long throat still. Trun, who was no longer the second voice but the 10th, stood behind her with his eyes on the floor. "Ambassador," said the Grand Chamberlain, "Chamberlain, you escorted this human for 6 sector turns. Yes, you knew what he was." "No," said Lazeri. She said it quietly. "I did not." The Chamberlain regarded her a long moment. His slow yellow eyes were, in the private library, less patient than they had been in the balcony. "Then," he said, "you understand now." "Yes, you understand," said the Grand Chamberlain, "that the count you do not count is the count that ends you." Lazeri inclined her head. The Grand Chamberlain lifted his fan from his knee and opened it and closed it and opened it again, a small, courtly rhythm that meant in his tongue, "The matter is now closed." He looked past her at Otran. The former second voice did not look up. The former second voice would spend the next 20 years of his career sitting in the 10th chair, moving quietly through the small business of the lower court, and he would never again in his life eat a meal without tasting faintly the copper of his own inner lip. This too was in the record. This too the Chamberlain had signed with his own hand. The Chamberlain closed the fan. "You may go, Ambassador," he said. Lazeri rose. At the door of the library, she paused. She turned her long, translucent throat back toward the Chamberlain and asked, in the small, quiet voice a court princess used at the end of a formal audience for a question that was not quite formal, "Chamberlain, may I ask what has become of the human?" The Chamberlain looked at her. "He is at home, Ambassador," said the Grand Chamberlain. "He is drinking real coffee. He is at his sister's birthday. He is not thinking about us." "Ah, that," said the Grand Chamberlain, "is why we will let him be." Lazeri inclined her head once more and left. In the apartment on Zenith Street, on the small day of Rhoda's birthday, Pete Molnar sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was cheap and hot and tasted to him better than any cup a Grand Chamberlain of the Azaran of Nine Rings had ever served him. Rhoda was at the counter, cutting a slice of pink frosted sponge cake with the side of a butter knife. The little dog was asleep on Pete's boot. The radiator was ticking. The pipes were groaning. The tungsten pry bar was leaning in the corner by the door, next to the mop bucket, where Pete had set them both down when he had come in from work 6 days earlier, and where they would stay, undisturbed, for the rest of his life. Rhoda set the plate in front of him. "Happy birthday, Ro," Pete said. "Thanks, Petey." He took a bite of the cake. He drank his coffee. He looked out the kitchen window at the frozen lake down below the hill, where a fresh line of hull plating on the far shore was catching the last of the sunset in a long, slow, orange line. The way it always did in January, the way it had every January of his life. "Petey," Rhoda said. "Yeah." "You gonna go back to that job?" Pete Molnar considered this. He took another sip of his coffee. He looked at his sister across the small kitchen table in the small, warm apartment where the pipes groaned when the weather dropped, and the little dog snored on his boot, and the winter light came in gold across the floor. "Nah," he said. "I think I might take a shift or 2 off." Rhoda smiled. "Good," she said. Outside, the frozen lake went on being the frozen lake, and the small dog snored, and the pipes groaned, and Pete Molnar drank his real coffee, and none of it, not the pipes, not the dog, not the coffee, not the sister across the table, knew that 4 decks above an arena orbiting a blue and brass flagship named Asaran of Nine Rings, a Grand Chamberlain was closing a fan on a report and telling his attendants that the human was to be left alone. None of it needed to know. Pete finished his cake. He finished his coffee. He took the plate to the sink and washed it because it was not somebody else's job and never had been. And then he sat back down at the table and let his sister tell him, in the ordinary, sensible voice of the ordinary, sensible sister who'd been asking him home since he was a boy, about the small, ordinary week that had happened while he was gone. He listened to every word. He counted none of them. He had already used up his 8. What a story! The truth of it, in the end, is a small, quiet one. The truest strength is never the one that boasts, never the one that draws first, never the one anyone counts. It is the quiet man in the coveralls who was going home anyway and would go through you to get there. If this story hit you where it lives, leave your like. That little tap is what keeps these tales alive out here in the dark. Share it with anyone you know who loves science fiction, where the underestimated human stares down the impossible and refuses to blink. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you do not miss the next HFY story we tell around this fire. And here is the question, the honest one, and I want your answer in the comments. If you had been on that balcony with Pete Molnar's file in your hand, would you have hired him to train your fleet? Or would you have handed him his coffee, wished him well, and quietly put him on the next shuttle home? Tell me, I want to know. Until the next one, friend, keep your eyes on the stars and keep counting the days that matter.